There are men who build empires with money, and men who control entire worlds with fear. Rafael Moro was one of those men, a mafia boss who never lost control. Never questioned, never needed anyone, until the night he stepped into a deal in a foreign country and realized he couldn't understand a single word being spoken around him. No translator, no backup, no control. And then she appeared, a woman who wasn't impressed by his power, not intimidated by his name, and not even aware of the danger standing right in front of her. But what Raphael didn't know was that she wasn't just translating his words. She was deciding how the world would hear him. And in a world where language is power, losing control of translation means losing control of everything. What starts as a business negotiation slowly turns into something far more dangerous, not because of guns or enemies, but because for the first time in his life, Raphael is forced to depend on someone he cannot control. And that dependency changes everything. This is a channel about mafia bosses, men born to dominate, to command, to survive worlds most people never even sat. Not just crime stories, but stories about mindset, power, discipline, and the hidden rules that govern real influence. Because some lessons are never taught in schools, only learned in the shadow of power. This story will leave you asking one question. What happens when the most powerful man in the room can't understand what's being said? If you enjoy deep, psychological mafia boss stories like this, make sure to like, comment your thoughts, share the video, and subscribe, because every story here reveals a hidden side of power you were never meant.
The plane had been in descent for nearly 10 minutes, but Rafe Morrow didn't feel the shift in altitude the way most people did. For him, movement was just another form of control being transferred from one system to another. Air to ground, private to public, silence to negotiation. He sat alone in the leather cabin of the jet, one leg crossed over the other, a half-finished glass of water resting untouched on the small table beside him. Outside the window, Seoul was beginning to reveal itself through layers of morning haze, steel glass, highways already alive with motion. A city that never fully stopped, even when it pretended to rest. Rafe did look impressed. He never did. Impression was an emotional response, and emotional responses were variables he didn't trust. Instead, he opened the briefing folder again, not because he needed to read it, but because it gave his hands something to do while his mind stayed ahead of the situation. Victor Harrington's Empire More was clean, international shipping lanes, corporate logistics, infrastructure contracts across Asia and Europe. The kind of structure that looked legal until you stared at it long enough to see what it was built on instead of what it claimed to be. Rafe turned a page slowly, then another. He already knew most of it. What he didn't know was what had been removed before the documents ever reached him. That was always the real negotiation. Behind him, the cabin door opened quietly. A voice followed immediately after, careful and rehearsed. "Sir, there's been a change." Rafe didn't look up. He didn't need to. If someone was speaking to his space without invitation, it meant the situation had already shifted away from control. Marco didn't board, the assistant continued. He called 4 hours before departure. "Family emergency. We've attempted contact again, but he's unavailable." Silence settled in, not the comfortable kind. The kind that meant something had already gone wrong, and everyone was waiting to see how badly. Rafe closed the folder, slowly, not out of frustration, out of calculation. "Unavailable," he repeated. "Yes, sir." Rafe stood up, moving toward the window at the edge of the cabin. Below them, the Pacific stretched endlessly, a flat, indifferent surface that had no interest in human plans or interruptions. "Who replaced him?" he asked. There was a pause before the answer came. "Local coordination team arranged a substitute. Verified interpreter. She be waiting at the hotel. Credentials are solid. Government-level work. Corporate negotiations. Multilingual experience across East Asia and Europe." Rafe didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched the horizon. Something about the situation had already changed shape, even if nothing had yet fully revealed itself. Name, he said finally. Vera Shah. That was the first new variable. Rafe repeated it silently, not because it mattered emotionally, but because unfamiliar names always carried weight until proven otherwise. Who approved her? He asked. Henry Vale's office recommended her. That was the second variable. Henry Vale wasn't he someone who made random decisions. Everything he touched had intent behind it, even when it looked accidental. Rafe turned away from the window. Marco didn't explain why he left? No, sir. Of course he didn't. People rarely explained the real reason when the truth had consequences. Rafe walked back toward the table, placing the folder down with controlled precision. His movements were calm, but there was a subtle tightening in the room now, like pressure building behind glass. Have her ready at the hotel, he said. Yes, sir. The assistant left quickly, as if leaving too slowly might make him part of the problem. Rafe remained alone again. But the silence felt different now, not empty. Interrupted, because something had already entered the system without permission. And he didn't like that, not even a little. The Shilla Hotel didn't announce its luxury. It didn't need to. Everything about it was designed for people who already understood status and didn't to require reminders of it. Stone, glass, soft lighting, controlled silence. A place where power could rest without being observed too closely. Rafe arrived just after sunrise. The lobby was active, but quietly so. Staff moved with practiced invisibility. Conversations stayed low. Even footsteps seemed negotiated in advance. Everything was built around the idea that important people should never have to feel the presence of others unless they chose to. Rafe noticed all of it automatically. He always did. Control wasn't he something he'd not, and it was something he never turned off, and then he saw her. Not immediately. First, he noticed the space around her. People weren't approaching her. They weren't guiding her. They weren't adjusting their behavior the way they did for everyone else in the room. That alone made her stand out more than anything else. She stood near a column by the lounge entrance, holding a small leather bag in one hand and a coffee in the other. No urgency. No performance. Just stillness that didn't request attention, but somehow prevented others from ignoring her. Rafe slowed slightly. Not because he recognized her, because he recognized the absence of reaction around her. That usually meant one of two things. Either she was irrelevant, or she was important enough that people didn't know how to behave. Both possibilities mattered. When he approached, she turned before anyone introduced him. Not early, not late. Exactly when she should have. Mr. Morrow, she said. No hesitation. No softness. Just recognition. Vera Shaw, he replied. A brief pause followed. Not awkward, measured. The kind of pause that most people rush to fill with unnecessary words. Neither of them did. I've reviewed the briefing materials, she said. There are inconsistencies in the terminology used in Harrington's documentation. If we don't clarify them before the meeting, the interpretation will distort intent. Rafe studied her for a moment, not her appearance, her structure, her discipline, the way she didn't ask questions to fill space, but to reduce uncertainty. Most interpreters were passive conduits. She wasn't. You'll have 30 minutes in the car, Rafe said. I need 45. That should have been the end of the exchange. Most people would have stopped there. Rafe didn't. Neither did she. 45 a simple fact, not negotiation. But she does retreat. I understand, she said. Then I'll compress the necessary clarifications into 30. That was new, not agreement, adaptation. Rafe nodded once. Fine. She didn't react. She simply adjusted her posture slightly, as if the timeline had already been accounted for in her mind before he spoke. They moved toward the elevator together. No escort conversation. No formal introductions. Just movement. Inside the elevator, silence settled again. But this time it wasn't empty. It was structured. She spoke first. Victor Harrington communicates in layered phrasing, she said. Literal meaning will not be sufficient. I need to know how far you allow interpretation to extend. Rafe glanced at her. That was not a typical question. Most interpreters asked what tone to use. She was asking how far reality could be adjusted before it stopped being acceptable. Depends, he said, on what you reinterpreting. Intent, she replied. That word landed differently than expected. Intent wasn't T language. Intent was control before language existed. Rafe looked away briefly, not out of discomfort, but calculation. She was T just translating words. She was translating decisions before they became words. The elevator slowed. Marco used to handle this, Rafe said, without thinking. Yes, she replied immediately. I know. That stopped him for half a second. You do. I reviewed his interpretation patterns, she said. He softened your phrasing when tension rose, and intensified it when leverage was required. Rafe turned his head slightly. Most people didn't analyze him that closely. Most people didn't tell last long when they tried. And what do you do? He asked. She met his gaze directly. I remove prediction. That was the moment something shifted. Not visibly, not loudly, but internally, like a weight being redistributed in a system that had just discovered a missing component. The elevator doors opened. Before stepping out, Rafe spoke again. Marco was reliable. A pause. Until he wasn't T, Vera said. Rafe didn't he respond. Because that part, at least, was already understood. They stepped into the hallway. And for the first time since landing in Seoul, Rafe realized something he didn't say out loud. He was still in control of the meeting. But not of how it would be understood. And that difference was where real power always began. The car left the Shilla Hotel just before mid-morning, slipping into Seoul traffic with the kind of quiet precision that expensive vehicles always seem to carry, as if even the engine understood it was not supposed to disturb the world around it. Inside, the atmosphere was controlled, but not comfortable. Control and comfort were never the same thing in Rafe Morrow's world. Control was structure. Comfort was weakness disguised as peace. He sat in the back seat without leaning back, his posture relaxed in appearance but never in reality. Across from him, Vera Shaw had already opened a slim notebook. Not a laptop, not a tablet paper, ink, something deliberately slower than modern systems. Her pen moved lightly across the page as if she was something invisible. Rafe watched her for a moment before speaking. You said 45 minutes, he said. Yes, she replied without looking up. You have 30. I'm aware, that was all. No apology. No adjustment in tone. No visible stress response. Just acceptance of constraint and immediate recalibration inside it. Rafe leaned slightly toward the window. Outside, Seoul moved in layers, pedestrians crossing too quickly, delivery bikes weaving between lanes, glass towers, reflecting in a sky that still hadn't fully decided what kind of day it wanted to be. Everything looked functional. Everything looked like it was pretending not to be chaotic. Vera spoke again, still writing. I need to clarify something before we arrive. Go ahead. Victor Harrington doesn't just negotiate contracts. He embeds conditional authority into language. Certain phrases in English will be translated differently depending on hierarchy perception in Korean. Rafe glanced back at her. That sounds like interpretation, he said. It is, she replied, but it is also control. That word again, control. It always sounded clean until someone explained what it actually meant in practice. Rafe didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied her not in the way men studied people for attraction or curiosity, but in the way he studied risk. Vera Shaw didn't behave like someone who was trying to impress him. She behaved like someone who had already decided what mattered and what didn't. That was rare. Most people adjusted themselves around power. She didn't appear to. She adjusted power into something she could carry. The car turned onto a wider avenue, and the city opened up in front of them, like a layered system of intention. Rafe broke the silence again. Marco would have handled this differently, he said. Vera finally looked up from her notebook. Yes, you knew him? I studied his work patterns, she said. He had a tendency to prioritize emotional smoothing over structural accuracy. Rafe narrowed his eyes slightly. Emotional smoothing. Yes, she said. He made your tone more acceptable, even when it weakened meaning. Rafe didn't respond immediately. That was not an accusation, but it also was neutral. It was analysis. And analysis in his world always came with consequences. You think that's a weakness, he said. I think it depends on outcome, she replied. But in high-stakes negotiation, softened language creates interpretive gaps. Gaps create leverage for the other side. Rafe turned his head slightly. You re-saying Marco made me weaker. I am saying he's made you less precise. There was a difference, a subtle one, but important. Rafe didn't like being imprecise. He didn't build his life on approximation. The car slowed as traffic thickened near the financial district. Tall buildings closed in around them, reflecting sunlight like fragmented mirrors. Somewhere in this city, Victor Harrington was preparing for a meeting that would decide the structure of a deal worth hundreds of millions, maybe more, depending on how language shifted once spoken out loud. Rafe had seen men lose fortunes because of a single misinterpreted pause. He had also seen men gain empires from one. That was why Vera mattered more than she should. Not because she was important, because she was unavoidable. The Harrington Tower was not subtle. It didn't try to be. Glass, steel, vertical dominance, everything about it was designed to communicate authority before anyone even entered the building. The kind of architecture that doesn't ask permission to exist. Rafe stepped out of the car first. Vera followed immediately, closing her notebook as she walked. She didn't look up at the building for long. Most people did. Most people needed a moment to adjust themselves to scale. She didn't. She adjusted to function instead. Inside, the lobby was already prepared for them. Security recognized Rafe immediately, not because of personal familiarity, but because systems like this were trained to recognize threat-level presence long before identity mattered. They were guided forward without delay, no waiting, no hesitation, efficiency that felt like respect but was teat. Vera walked slightly behind Rafe, not out of submission but positioning. She was already reading the environment: security spacing, conversational distance, acoustic separation. Her eyes moved subtly, continuously mapping invisible systems. Rafe noticed. Most people looked at spaces. She looked at structure inside space. That was not the same skill set. They entered the private elevator. As the doors closed, silence tightened again. Vera spoke first. "He will test you within the first 5 minutes," she said. "How?" "By implying familiarity you haven't agreed to," she replied. "He will attempt to establish psychological proximity before contractual clarity." Rafe nodded once. "And how do you translate that?" "I don't," she said. "I neutralize it." That caught his attention. "Neutralize, yes. I remove implied intimacy without disrupting formal respect." Rafe studied her again. "You do that often." "In rooms like this," she said, "language is never neutral." The elevator stopped, doors opened, and the room waiting on the other side was already filled with presence. Victor Harrington stood near the far end of a long conference table, older than expected, composed in a way that didn't rely on posture alone, the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice because the environment already adjusted itself around him. Two advisors stood behind him, and slightly to the side, a younger man, nervous posture, careful eyes, Tom Reed, interpreter. Rafe noticed him immediately, not because of importance, because of discomfort. There was always someone in every system who didn't fully belong to it. Victor extended a hand. "Rafe Morrow," he said smoothly. "Long journey." Rafe shook it. "Short enough," he replied. A smile from Victor. Measured. Then Victor looked past Rafe, at Vera, not directly acknowledging her at first, just observing her presence like one might observe an unlisted variable. "And you must be the interpreter," Victor said. "Yes," Vera replied. "No introduction of name yet. That mattered." Victor gestured toward the table. "Let us begin." They sat, not evenly spaced in power but evenly spaced in expectation, and immediately Victor began exactly as Vera predicted. He spoke casually first, almost conversational, the kind of tone designed to create false ease. Rafe listened. Vera translated. But something subtle happened in her translations, something Rafe noticed within the first 30 seconds. She was not repeating Victor's words. She was adjusting their weight, softening certain implications, tightening others, removing emotional manipulation before it could attach itself to meaning. Rafe looked at her once, just once, and understood something important. She was not translating for communication. She was translating for outcome. Victor leaned slightly forward. "So," he said, "it's good to finally meet the man behind the logistics channels." Rafe responded calmly. "I am the logistics channel," Vera translated. But she added nothing. She removed nothing. That was intentional. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly. A test. Then he shifted again. And I assume you understand the value of cooperation between families in our line of work. Rafe didn't respond immediately, because Vera hesitated for a fraction of a second, not visibly, but internally. Then she translated, and in that translation something changed. A phrase was slightly reframed, not altered. Redirected. Victor noticed. Rafe noticed too. But neither reacted outwardly. The room stayed intact, but underneath it something had shifted. Victor smiled again, and this time it was T entirely controlled. Interesting interpreter, he said. Rafe didn't look at Vera, but his awareness of her increased, because now it was no longer theoretical. She wasn't just present in the room, she was affecting it, and in his world, that meant only one thing. She was part of the negotiation now, whether she intended to be or not. The meeting ended the way most dangerous meetings ended, when no one wanted to show their hand too early, politely, cleanly, almost boring on the surface. Handshakes were exchanged again, smiles were controlled. Promises were not made, but they were implied in ways that could later be denied if necessary. Rafe Morrow had seen that pattern 1,000 times. The performance of civility was just another form of violence, delayed and dressed well. But what stayed with him as they left the Harrington Tower was not Victor Harrington's posture, or the way his advisors moved like trained shadows behind him. It was Vera Shaw, because something had changed in the room when she translated. Not dramatically, not obviously, but in a way that anyone trained to feel leverage would recognize instantly. She had adjusted meaning, not distorted it, not betrayed it, adjusted it. And in Rafe's world, that was not a small thing. That was a form of power. They stepped back into the elevator alone this time. The doors closed, sealing out the polished steel world behind them. The silence inside was heavier than before, not because anything had been said, but because something had been understood. Rafe broke it first. "You changed what he said," he said. Vera didn't look up immediately. She was already reviewing mental notes, replaying phrasing, tone, implication structures. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm. "I adjusted the translation to preserve intent. That's not what I asked." She looked at him now. "I know." A pause. Rafe's eyes narrowed slightly. "Explain it." Vera shifted her weight slightly, still composed, still professional, but now more deliberate in her explanation. "When Victor Harrington speaks, he does just communicate. He embeds hierarchy pressure into casual phrasing. If I translate that literally, the Korean side would interpret it as a social imbalance rather than a contractual discussion." Rafe listened. "And you think that's your job to correct?" "It's my job to ensure you are understood correctly," she replied, not just heard. The elevator descended, floor numbers changing in silence. Rafe studied her face, not attraction, not curiosity, evaluation. "You didn't correct it," he said slowly. "You redirected it. Vera didn't deny it. That's sometimes necessary. Necessary for who?" A beat of silence. Then Vera answered honestly. "For the outcome you're repaying for." That answer landed differently. Because it was defensive, it was emotional, it was structural. Rafe exhaled slightly through his nose, looking away for a moment as the elevator continued its descent. Most people in his world either obeyed language or feared it. Vera manipulated it like an instrument, and she did it without asking permission from either side of the table. That was not common, that was not safe, but it was effective. The elevator doors opened. They stepped into the lobby again, where the world outside waited with its usual indifference to what had just happened above it. The car was already there, waiting. The ride back to the hotel was quieter than before, not peaceful, controlled. There was a difference. Rafe watched the city move outside the window again, but this time it felt less like background noise and more like layered systems of intention he hadn't fully accounted for. He spoke without turning. Marco would not have done that. Vera responded after a brief pause. "No, why not?" "Because he believed neutrality meant literal," she said. He avoided interpretation, even when interpretation was required for clarity. Rafe turned slightly toward her now. "And you don't tea?" "No," she said simply. Silence followed. Then Rafe asked something else. "What did you change in his phrasing?" Vera hesitated for half a second, not because she didn't know, because she was deciding how much truth was necessary. Then she answered. I reduced implied dominance language, and I shifted one phrase into conditional framing. Rafe processed that, and Victor noticed. Yes. Does that matter? Vera looked at him directly now. Yes, that single word carried weight, because it wasn't theoretical. It was acknowledgement of consequence. Rafe leaned back slightly for the first time since the meeting began earlier that day. For a man like him, control was not a preference. It was architecture, and someone had just demonstrated they could alter the structure of his interactions without asking for approval. That should have bothered him more than it did. Instead, it intrigued him. Back at the hotel, the atmosphere shifted again. The hallway outside Rafe's suite was quiet, carpet-absorbing sounds like it had been designed for secrecy rather than comfort. Vera stopped outside her designated room. Rafe stopped as well. For a moment, neither moved. Then Rafe spoke. "You're not just interpreting language," he said. Vera didn't respond immediately, I know. That was not what he meant. But it was close enough. He stepped slightly closer, not invading space but reducing distance. "People don't usually adjust what I say in real time," he continued. "I understand." "No," he corrected quietly. "You don't understand yet." That made her look at him more carefully, not defensively, analytically. Rafe continued. "In my world, language is the safest thing. It's predictable. Contracts, threats, negotiations, they all rely on structure. If language becomes flexible, then structure becomes uncertain." Vera nodded once. "That is true." "And you made it flexible." "Yes," a pause. Then Vera added something unexpected, but not unsafe. Rafe studied her. "You think you can control that level of flexibility?" "I think I have to," she said. That was the first time her voice carried something slightly beyond professionalism. Not emotion, but weight, responsibility. Rafe didn't respond immediately, because that answer revealed more than she probably intended. Or maybe exactly what she intended. He finally spoke again. "You re-aware what kind of people I deal with?" "Yes." "And you still think you can manage how I am perceived in a room like that?" Vera met his gaze. "I'm not managing perception," she said. "I'm managing misunderstanding." That distinction mattered. Rafe recognized it, and for the first time since meeting her, he stopped thinking of Vera Shaw as an external function. Interpreter. Service provider. Variable. And started thinking of her as something else entirely. A system inside the system. One that was already influencing outcomes without asking permission to exist. Later that night, Rafe remained awake longer than usual, not because of danger, not because of pressure, because of analysis. He sat near the window of his suite, looking down at Sol S lights spread across distance like a living circuit board. On the table beside him sat a glass of water untouched, and a folder of documents he had already read 3 times without finding anything new. Except now, he was thinking less about the documents and more about the person who had stood between him and the meaning of those documents all day. Vera Shaw did not behave like someone impressed by power. She behaved like someone who understood it too well to be distracted by it. That was rare and dangerous, because people like that didn't follow systems. They adjusted them. A knock came at the door. Rafe didn't move immediately. He already knew who it was. He opened it. Vera stood there, same posture, same calm expression, but now there was something slightly different in her hand. Her notebook. She held it loosely, not offering it, not hiding it. "I need to clarify something," she said. "About today." Rafe stepped aside. She entered, the door closed, and for the first time since meeting her, the dynamic of the room changed without anyone else present to validate it. This was no longer interpretation under observation. This was direct exchange. Vera stood near the table. "I should have told you I adjusted phrasing," she said. Rafe watched her. "Yes, but I didn't want to interrupt the flow of negotiation." "That's not the reason," he said calmly. Vera paused, then nodded slightly. "No," she admitted. "It's not." Silence stretched. Then Rafe asked the question that mattered. "Why did you do it?" Vera looked at him. And for the first time, her answer wasn't purely technical. "Because if I translated him exactly as he spoke," she said, "you would have responded to something that was to actually being said." Rafe studied her for a long moment. "And what were you protecting?" She didn't answer immediately. Not because she didn't know, but because she was deciding whether the answer was safe to give. Then she said it. "Clarity." That word stayed in the room longer than anything else that day. Because clarity was not always neutral. Sometimes clarity removed advantage. Sometimes it removed illusion. Sometimes it removed control. Rafe looked at her notebook. You write everything down, he said. Yes, even me. Yes, a pause. Then Vera added something quietly. You pause before important decisions. Rafe didn't deny it. And you look at your left hand when you decide whether to trust someone, she continued. Rafe looked down slightly. His left hand rested near the table. Still, she had noticed. Of course she had. Because she was not observing him casually. She was cataloging patterns. Rafe leaned slightly forward. You read dangerous in a room like that, he said. Vera met his gaze evenly. No, she replied. I am necessary, and in that moment, Rafe understood something that would not fully settle until much later. She wasn't trying to be important. She was trying to be accurate, and accuracy, in his world, was far more disruptive than ambition. The problem was no longer whether Vera Shaw could translate. The problem was what she would decide to translate and how much of reality would survive the process. Rafe didn't sleep much that night, not because something had gone wrong, but because something had gone unresolved. There was a difference he had learned to respect over the years. Danger was loud, but uncertainty was quiet. Danger announced itself. Uncertainty stayed in the background and changed the shape of everything without asking permission. And now, for the first time in a long time, Rafe Morrow was operating inside uncertainty he didn't design. It was the deal with Victor Harrington. It was soul. It was even if the shifting dynamics in the room between him and Vera Shaw. It was the suitcase. He had opened it once before the meeting, checked everything. Standard procedure. Clean inspection. No anomalies. And yet something about it still felt wrong. Not logically. Intuitively. That was the kind of feeling he had learned not to ignore. By morning, he had already made a decision. He didn't tell anyone. Not his security, not Hyun, the local contact, not Vera. He simply waited until she arrived. She came exactly on time. Same posture, same calm control. But today her eyes moved slightly faster when she entered the room, scanning the environment before settling on him. Rafe noticed. She was learning him too. That was becoming a pattern neither of them were acknowledging directly. You didn't sleep, she said. It wasn't a question. No, he replied. Vera placed her notebook on the table. Something changed. Yes. She waited. Rafe stood near the window of the suite, looking out at the city again, but this time not seeing it. I want to check something, he said. About the meeting? No. A pause. Then he turned slightly. About my luggage. That stopped her for half a second. Not visibly dramatic, but enough. Because luggage in his world was not a casual topic. It was controlled space, private space, secure space. What are you expecting to find? She asked. I don't know, he said honestly. That alone changed the tone of the room. Vera studied him for a moment longer than usual. Then she nodded once. Okay, no resistance, no questioning of necessity, just acceptance of function. That was something Rafe was starting to notice about her. She didn't waste time resisting reality. She adjusted to it. The hotel suite was large enough that silence had multiple locations inside it. Rafe placed the suitcase on the center table, black, hard shell, minimal markings, the kind of object that didn't attract attention because it assumed it would never need to. Vera stood a few steps away, not interfering, but not detached either. She was watching him the way she watched conversations, tracking intent, not movement. Rafe opened the lock. Combination entered without hesitation. Click. The suitcase opened. Inside was exactly what it should have contained. Clothing, documents, a small encrypted drive, nothing out of place, nothing unusual, at least at first glance. Rafe didn't move for a moment. Then he started removing items slowly, not rushed, systematic. Vera didn't speak. She watched, not him, the process. That was important. Because she was just observing what he did, she was observing what he expected to find. After a minute, he paused, then reached deeper into the lining and stopped. There was something there. Not obvious, not visible unless you knew to look. A seam slightly uneven, too smooth in one section. He pressed lightly, then pulled, a hidden layer. Inside was a thin envelope, no markings, no identification, just paper. Rafe stared at it for a moment before opening it. Vera stepped slightly closer, still not speaking. Rafe unfolded the document and read. The first page was T English, it was T Italian, it was T Korean, it was Japanese. His expression didn't T change immediately, but something in the air did, because now the suitcase was T just a container. It was a message. He turned the page and read again, longer this time, then stopped. Vera didn't ask, she waited. Rafe closed the document slowly. That wasn't mine, he said finally. I know, she replied. His eyes shifted slightly. You can read it. Yes, a pause. Then tell me what it is. Vera hesitated, not because she didn't understand, but because understanding carried weight. Then she spoke its internal documentation, she said, transaction records, between corporate intermediaries and a government-linked construction authority. Rafe's gaze sharpened slightly in origin. Japan, she said. Late 1990s. Another pause. Then she added something more carefully, and it implicates a current partner organization in Seoul. Silence. That kind of silence didn't sit still. It expanded. Rafe looked at the document again, slowly, then back at her. So someone placed this inside my luggage, he said, knowing I would arrive here with it. Yes, and knowing it would be discovered during or after the Harrington meeting. Yes, a beat. Rafe exhaled slowly through his nose. That means I'm not part of the deal, he said. I am part of the delivery system. Vera nodded once. That's the most likely structure. Rafe placed the document back into the envelope, carefully, like it had weight beyond paper. Then he looked at her. Who arranged my interpreter replacement? Vera didn't answer immediately. I don't know, she said. That's not your usual answer. It's the only honest one. That mattered. Rafe walked slightly away from the table, thinking, not reacting. That distinction was important to him. Then he spoke again. Marco didn't call 4 hours before the flight because of family, he said. Vera stayed still. No. A pause. He was removed. Yes, she said. Rafe turned slightly toward her. And you didn't tell me that either. I didn't have confirmation, she replied. Now you do, yes. Silence returned, this time heavier, because now the structure was clearer. Too clear. Someone had removed his interpreter, someone had inserted a replacement, someone had hidden a document inside his luggage, and all of it had converged on the same destination, Seoul. Rafe looked at Vera. Why me? He asked. It wasn't frustration. It was calculation. Vera considered the question.
Then answered carefully.
Because you are the one who can move things across borders without being questioned immediately. Rafe nodded slowly. That's what I thought. A pause. Then Vera added something quieter. But you were not the target. That stopped him. He turned fully toward her. Explain. Vera stepped closer to the table, not touching anything, just aligning herself with the structure of what she was describing. If this document becomes visible at the right moment, she said, it destabilizes Harrington's partner network in Seoul. Rafe followed, and me being here accelerates that visibility. Yes. So I am not the weapon, no. He studied her. I am the timing mechanism. Vera didn't correct him. That meant he was close. Rafe looked at the envelope again, then asked the next question, who benefits? Vera answered without hesitation now. That's still unclear. That honesty mattered more than speculation. Rafe closed the suitcase, not abruptly, but decisively. Then he turned back to her. From now on, he said, you tell me everything you hear that changes structure. Not interpretation, structure. Vera met his gaze. And if it compromises neutrality? Rafe didn't hesitate. There is no neutrality in this anymore. That sentence changed the room. Not emotionally, functionally. Because it removed a category of safety they had both been relying on without naming it. Vera nodded once. Understood. Later that day, they met Hyun. A different location, smaller room, less controlled environment. Hyun looked tired. Not physically, mentally. The kind of fatigue that comes from managing overlapping pressures without resolution. Rafe placed the envelope on the table. Hyun saw it, and immediately understood enough to lose some color from his face. You found it, Hyun said quietly. Yes, Rafe replied. Hyun didn't ask how, that was important. People who asked unnecessary questions in situations like this didn't survive long in systems like his. Hyun exhaled slowly. This complicates everything, he said. No, Rafe replied. It clarifies it. Hyun looked at Vera briefly. Then, back at Rafe. Marco didn't know what he was carrying, Hyun said. I know, and neither did you. I know that too. Silence. Then Hyun spoke again. Someone inside the coordination chain is moving assets without disclosure. Rafe nodded. Yes. Hyun hesitated. There's only a few people who could have accessed both scheduling and logistics at that level. Rafe didn't respond immediately because he already knew that list was short. Too short, which meant this wasn't random. It was precise. Vera spoke for the first time in the room. Then the question is T who had access, she said. It S who had motivation to create a conflict between Rafe and Harrington. Hyun looked at her, then slowly nodded. Yes. Rafe leaned back slightly, and for the first time the situation stopped feeling like chaos. It started feeling like design. And that was worse, because design meant intent. And intent meant someone had expected all of this to unfold exactly this way. Rafe looked at Vera, and for the first time, he didn't just see an interpreter. He saw something closer to what the system actually needed to survive this. Someone who could see structure before it collapsed, but also someone who might already be too close to the center of it. By the time they reached Harrington Tower again, the building no longer looked like architecture. It looked like intent. Rafe noticed that shift immediately. The same glass, the same steel, the same quiet vertical arrogance. But now, after the discovery in the suitcase, everything felt reinterpreted, because once you know a system is designed, you stop seeing it as natural. You start seeing the hands behind it. Vera walked beside him, not behind him this time, not formally ahead either, just aligned. That subtle change would have meant nothing to most people. But in Rafe Morrow's world, alignment was not accidental. It was a statement without words. They entered. The lobby staff already knew them, but this time, something was different in how they looked at Rafe. Not respect, not fear. Recognition, as if the building itself had adjusted its understanding of who he was. Vera noticed it too. She always noticed. That was becoming the pattern. They moved toward the elevator. Security protocols opened without delay. The system already categorized them as expected. But expected no longer meant safe. It just meant accounted for. Inside the elevator, silence returned quickly. The kind that didn't feel empty, but compressed. Rafe spoke first. No more adjustments without telling me, he said. Vera didn't look at him immediately. I didn't adjust anything today, she replied. That's not what I meant. She understood. He meant control. She nodded once, understood. But there was something else underneath that exchange now. Trust was no longer abstract, it was procedural and fragile. The conference room on the 40th floor was already prepared. Victor Harrington was waiting. Tom Reed stood slightly him, posture tighter than before, less confident, more aware. And this time, there was a third presence in the room. A man Rafe hadn't seen before. Older, European, neutral suit, neutral expression. But nothing about him was actually neutral. Rafe noticed him immediately, because men who don't introduce themselves are never background characters. Victor gestured lightly. Before we begin, he said, we have a small clarification to make. Rafe didn't sit immediately. Neither did Vera, Victor continued. This is Adrian Keller. He is here to ensure all parties are aligned regarding the documentation protocols for today's discussion. Rafe didn't respond. He simply looked at the man. Keller returned the gaze without reaction. Vera, however, reacted differently. Not outwardly, internally. A micro shift in attention. Rafe noticed that too. Victor smiled slightly. We all here to ensure transparency, he said. That word landed differently now. Transparency. After the suitcase, after Marco, after the hidden document, transparency sounded like a joke someone forgot to laugh at. They sat. The room reorganized itself again into familiar geometry. Power at one end, pressure distributed across distance, interpretation as the invisible bridge between. But today, the bridge felt unstable. Victor began speaking. Casual tone again, controlled familiarity again. But Rafe didn't listen the same way anymore. He was listening for structure beneath language. Not meaning structure, Versa translated. But now her translations were different. Not softer, not harsher. More precise, like she had stopped trying to manage tone and started mapping intent instead. Rafe noticed immediately. Victor leaned forward slightly, so he said, before we proceed, I want to ensure there are no misunderstandings about scope. Rafe responded, there are none. Vera translated, But this time, she didn't eat smooth anything. She preserved the exact weight of his words. Victor paused for the first time, a fraction longer than usual, then smiled. Good, he said. But it was fully convincing, Keller observed silently. Tom Reed shifted slightly in his seat, and Vera wrote something small in her notebook without breaking eye contact with the room. Rafe saw that too. The conversation moved forward, but not smoothly, because now every sentence had a shadow behind it. Victor spoke about logistics timelines, about compliance expectations, about cross-border asset movement, and each time, Vera translated with surgical accuracy. No interpretation, no correction, just translation. And something subtle began to happen. Victor started repeating himself, not because it was unclear, because he was testing response stability. And Rafe noticed that too. He turned slightly toward Vera during a pause. Why did you change your approach? He asked quietly. She didn't hesitate. You asked for structure, she said. That S not structure, he replied. That S exposure. Vera looked at him, and for the first time, there was something slightly sharper in her expression. It was already exposed, she said. You just weren't hearing it clearly. That sentence landed, not emotionally, but strategically, because it implied something Rafe had already begun to suspect. The conversation was to just negotiation. It was calibration. Someone in the room was measuring reaction thresholds. Victor continued speaking, but now his eyes moved differently, more often toward Vera, less toward Rafe. That shift mattered. Rafe noticed it immediately, because it meant the interpreter was no longer invisible. She was now part of the signal. Halfway through the meeting, Victor paused. He looked at Keller, then spoke in English directly, bypassing conversational rhythm. We should address the secondary matter. Rafe didn't react, but Vera did, not visibly, but internally again. Keller opened a folder and placed a document on the table. Not the suitcase document. Something else. Knew Rafe didn't touch it. Vera leaned slightly forward to read. Her eyes moved once, then stopped. That pause lasted less than a second. But Rafe caught it, and it mattered, because Vera rarely paused when reading. She processed. This time she paused. She translated, but slower, more carefully. Rafe's attention sharpened. What is it? He asked her quietly. Vera didn't answer immediately, because she was choosing how to frame it. Then she said, It's an internal escalation notice, she said, regarding asset misclassification. Rafe's eyes narrowed slightly. Whose asset? Vera hesitated for the first time in the meeting, and that hesitation changed everything. Because hesitation is not interpretation, it is recognition. Victor spoke again, calmly, but now the tone was different. This is not related to your contract directly, he said, but it affects the environment in which it will be executed. Rafe finally looked at Victor directly. For the first time, he said, I'm hearing you clearly. Victor smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Keller remained still. Tom Reed looked increasingly uncomfortable, and Vera closed her notebook slightly. Not fully, just enough, like she had finished mapping something. The meeting ended earlier than expected. No agreement breakdown, no confrontation, just controlled termination, which, in high-level systems, usually meant something had already been decided elsewhere. Outside the room, in the corridor, the air felt different again. Rafe walked without speaking for a while, Vera beside him. Then he finally asked, what was in that document Keller brought? Vera didn't answer immediately, not because she didn't know, because she was deciding whether to say it plainly. Then she did. It references movement of a financial instrument that was previously attributed to your organization, she said. But the classification suggests misdirection. Rafe stopped walking, just for a second, then resumed. So someone is framing movement through my channels. Yes, and Harrington is aware. Now he is, Rafe exhaled slowly, then looked at her. And you didn't tell me immediately. Vera met his gaze. I was verifying context before triggering reaction. That sentence mattered, because it meant she was now operating not just as interpreter, but as filter. Rafe studied her. You redeciding what I react to, he said. No, she replied. I am deciding when you have enough structure to react correctly. That distinction again, control versus timing. Rafe didn't respond immediately, because he recognized something uncomfortable. She was not becoming powerful inside his system. She was becoming necessary to prevent misfire inside it. And that was more dangerous. Later that night, they met again in a smaller room. Not planned, not scheduled, just convergence. Hyun was already there. He looked more stressed than before. Because information flow was accelerating faster than anyone's ability to stabilize it. He didn't sit immediately. He spoke first. Two things happened today, he said. Rafe waited. First, Hyun continued. Harrington has begun internal review of asset classification procedures. Rafe nodded once. And second? Hyun hesitated, then looked at Revere briefly. There is movement in Hong Kong, he said. Someone is coordinating secondary verification requests on your logistics history. Rafe's eyes sharpened. That means surveillance, he said. Yes, Hyun confirmed. Silence. Then Rafe looked at Vera. Who benefits from destabilizing both sides at once? He asked. Vera didn't answer immediately, because now the pattern was becoming visible. Not fully, but enough. Then she sees someone trying to remove both control structures simultaneously. Hyun looked at her. That's not a typical objective. No, she said. It's not profit-based. Rafe narrowed his eyes slightly. What is it then? Vera looked down at her notebook, then back up. Replacement, she said. That word changed the temperature of the room. Not emotionally, structurally, because replacement implies something deeper than conflict. It implies design beyond immediate actors. Rafe stood still for a moment, then spoke quietly. Then we not dealing with negotiation anymore. Vera nodded once. No, a pause. Now we dealing with architecture. And for the first time since arriving in Seoul, Rafe understood something fully. He was not inside a deal. He was inside a system being actively rewritten. And Vera Shaw was no longer just translating it. She was the first person helping him read the language it was being rewritten in. Rafe didn't trust silence anymore, not after Seoul. Silence had stopped being absence and started being concealment. Every pause now felt like something being decided without him, and that was the most dangerous kind of power that didn't announce itself. Vera noticed the change before anyone else did. She always noticed first, not because she was trying to, because she simply couldn't turn it off. They were in a smaller meeting room this time, off the main floor of Harrington Tower. No long table, no audience, just two advisors, Victor Harrington, Adrian Keller, and the consistent tension of decisions that had already begun to move before words caught up to them. Rafe sat still, but not relaxed. There was a difference. Vera stood slightly behind and to his right, as she always did in professional settings. But today, even that felt different, because nothing in this room was neutral anymore. Victor began speaking. Not about contracts this time, not about logistics, about structure, about risk alignment, about external interference vectors. Rafe listened, but Vera translated differently than before. Not emotionally, not stylistically, but strategically precise. Every phrase now carried full weight, no smoothing, no protection, just raw transfer of meaning. And Rafe noticed immediately, because the room started feeling heavier, more tense, more real. Victor leaned back slightly. This situation, he said, requires clarity from all parties. Rafe responded calmly. Then be clear, Vera translated, and for the first time, Victor's expression tightened, not visibly aggressive, but alert, because clarity, when unfiltered, removes comfort from manipulation. Adrian Keller spoke next, measured tone, carefully chosen words. But again, Vera did not soften anything. She translated exactly, and that exactness began to change the rhythm of the room. Tom Reed, who had been brought in earlier meetings but remained peripheral shifted in his seat. He was watching Vera now, not Rafe. That mattered, because interpreters are usually invisible. But Vera was T. She was becoming directional. Rafe noticed Keller glance at her twice during a single exchange. Not Rafe. Her. That meant the structure had already shifted. And Rafe didn't like shifts he didn't authorize. After the meeting ended, Victor left first. No handshake this time, just departure. Adrian Keller followed shortly after, exchanging a brief nod with Victor that felt less like courtesy and more like coordination. Tom Reed lingered for a moment longer than necessary, then left as well. And suddenly, the room felt empty in a different way. Not space, but removal. Rafe didn't move immediately, neither did Vera. That silence between them had become its own system. Frankly, Rafe spoke. You changed the way you translate it again. Vera didn't deny it. Yes, that wasn't what I asked you yesterday. I know. He turned slightly toward her, then why? Vera paused. Not because she was uncertain. Because she was choosing precision over speed. Because the environment changed, she said. Rafe narrowed his eyes slightly. Explain. Vera stepped closer to the table. Not into his space, but into shared focus. When you entered this system, she said, you were being interpreted through assumed structure. Business, logistics, negotiation. She paused. Now you are being interpreted as a variable inside a destabilizing system. Rafe did respond immediately, because that matched what he was beginning to suspect. Vera continued, if I soften language now, I distort how urgency is perceived. And distortion creates delayed reaction. Rafe studied her. So you removed protection, I removed delay, that distinction again. He was starting to recognize her entire operating philosophy, not emotional interpretation, not neutrality, efficiency of truth, even when truth created friction. Rafe leaned back slightly. You reaware that makes you visible, he said. Yes, and visibility in this room is dangerous. Yes, a pause. Then Rafe asked the real question. Do you care? Vera looked at him directly. I care about accuracy, she said. Not yes, not no, but principle. That answer should have frustrated him. Instead, it clarified something, because she wasn't aligning with him emotionally. She was aligning with structure. And structure, in her mind, came first. Later that evening, Rafe requested a private location. Not the hotel suite, not a corporate space, a neutral room arranged through Hyun. Simple, controlled, minimal surveillance. When Vera arrived, she paused slightly at the door. Not hesitation, assessment, then entered. Rafe was already there, standing near the window. No documents, no phone, just presence. He didn't turn immediately. I want to understand something, he said. Vera closed the door behind her. Go ahead. He turned now. Yesterday you said this is no longer negotiation. Yes. You said it S architecture. Yes. Rafe studied her carefully. Then who is designing it? That question hung differently in the room. Because it wasn't about Victor Harrington anymore. Or Keller. Or even Hyun. It was broader. Vera didn't answer immediately. She walked slightly toward the center of the room, then spoke carefully. I don't know, she said. That honesty mattered. Because it removed speculation. And speculation was where manipulation lived. Rafe nodded slowly. But you see patterns. Yes. Then tell me what pattern you see. Vera hesitated for the first time in a way that wasn't T purely analytical. Because this wasn't T translation anymore. This was implication. Then she said, two systems are being forced into conflict using shared logistical channels, she said. But neither system initiated the conflict. Rafe's gaze sharpened. So both are reacting. Yes. And someone is triggering reaction. Yes. Rafe stepped closer. Then what is the goal? Vera met his eyes. And for the first time her voice softened slightly, not emotionally, but carefully. To identify which system responds faster under pressure. Silence. That answer reframed everything. Not profit, not control, but evaluation. Rafe looked away for a moment, then back. That means we re-not the target, he said. No. We re the test. Yes. That word landed heavier than the rest, because being a target implies conflict. Being a test implies design. And design implies intent beyond immediate visibility. Rafe exhaled slowly, then asked something quieter. And you still translating this for me? Yes. Why? Vera paused. Longer this time. Then answered. Because if I don't, she said, you will interpret it through incomplete structure. Rafe studied her, and that would lead to wrong decisions. Yes, a pause. Then she added something unexpected. And I think someone is counting on that. That shifted the air again, because it introduced adversarial awareness. Not just conflict, manipulated perception. Rafe walked back toward the window, looking out at Seoul again. But this time, it didn't feel like a city, it felt like layered inference. Every light a possible signal, every movement a possible test. He spoke without turning. Marco was removed because of health, he said. No, he was removed because he saw something. Vera didn't respond immediately. Then quietly, yes. Rafe turned slightly. And you didn't tell me that immediately either. I verified before confirming. He nodded. That was becoming her pattern. Verification before disclosure, not withholding, filtering. But the difference between filtering and withholding was narrowing, and both of them knew it. That night, Vera stayed longer than expected. Not by request, by necessity. Because information was accumulating faster than separation could stabilize. Hyun joined them briefly. He looked more exhausted than before. And more cautious. He placed a small file on the table. This came through unofficial channels, he said. Rafe didn't touch it immediately. Vera opened it instead. She read quickly, then slower. Her expression didn't change dramatically. But something inside her recalibrated. Rafe noticed. "What is it?" he asked. Vera closed the file gently. "It confirms external coordination across multiple logistics intermediaries," she said. "Not just Hong Kong, not just Seoul." Hyun nodded. "There's activity in Europe as well." Rafe leaned back slightly. "Then this is coordinated globally." "Yes," Hyun said. Silence. Then Vera added quietly, "and synchronized." That word mattered. Because synchronization implies timing, and timing implies control. Rafe looked at her. "Then someone is not just observing reactions," he said. "They re-orchestrating them." Vera nodded once. "Yes." A long pause. Then Rafe spoke quietly. "Then we stop reacting." Vera met his gaze. "And do what instead?" Rafe's expression hardened slightly. "We start controlling interpretation." Silence, because that was the real shift. Not action, not defense, but narrative control. And Vera understood immediately, because interpretation was her domain, and now it had become weaponized. Rafe had learned something important over the years. Men don't change tone when they lie. They change tone when they believe they're finally telling the truth that matters. That was the first thing he noticed when Park Jin-ho entered the room that morning. It wasn't anger, it wasn't fear. It was resignation wrapped in control. The kind of control that only exists when someone has already accepted that they are no longer in charge of the outcome. The room was smaller this time, no long table, no layered hierarchy of seating. Just 4 chairs, a glass surface, and a silence that felt deliberately engineered. Park sat first, not because he was invited, because he decided to. That alone was a message. Tommy Park stood behind him again, but not as interpreter this time, as witness. Hyun was already present, standing near the door, watching everything like a man who had stopped believing he could intervene in what was coming next. And Vera stood beside Rafe, not behind him, not offset, beside him. That detail mattered more than anyone in the room wanted to admit, because proximity is never neutral in environments where meaning is currency. Park looked at Rafe for a long time before speaking, not assessing, not measuring, confirming. Then he spoke. "This is no longer about the document." Rafe didn't respond immediately, because statements like that are never conclusions. They are repositioning attempts. He leaned slightly forward. "Then what is it about?" Park exhaled slowly, a controlled breath, a practiced one. The fact that someone believed it could be used. Silence. Vera didn't translate immediately. She watched Rafe first, then Park, then Hyun, then the room itself. Because translation, in moments like this, is not language. It is alignment of consequence. Finally, she spoke quietly. "He is saying the existence of the document is no longer the issue," she said. "The perception of its usability is." Rafe's eyes narrowed slightly. "So someone is manufacturing perception." Park nodded, yes. No hesitation, no deflection. That was new. Rafe studied him carefully. "Why tell me this now?" Park looked down briefly at his hands, then back up. "Because I now understand I was not the intended endpoint." Silence again. That phrase changed the temperature in the room. Not because it was complex, because it was specific. Intended endpoint. Rafe spoke slowly, then who was? Park didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Vera, not Rafe, not Hyun. "Vera." That shift did not go unnoticed. "I was told," Park said carefully, "that an American logistics operator would be carrying leverage material into this environment." Rafe's expression didn't change. "But something behind it recalibrated. And you believed that." "I believed enough to act." Rafe nodded slowly. "Which is the same as believing completely in your world." Park deny it. Vera spoke before silence could harden. "Who told you?" Park hesitated for the first time. "Not uncertainty. Selection. Because naming is always a form of escalation." Finally, "a coordination intermediary operating out of Hong Kong." Hyun shifted slightly at the door. That name mattered. Rafe noticed. "So this is chain-fed misinformation," Rafe said. Park shook his head slightly. "No." A pause. It is structured misinformation. That distinction mattered, because structured misinformation is not accidental, it is designed. Vera translated carefully. He is saying this was not a misunderstanding, she said. It was constructed to behave like one. Rafe leaned back slightly. So we were never negotiating with reality. Park looked at him directly. No, he said, you were reacting to it. Silence. That sentence landed differently for Rafe, because reacting implies lag, and lag is always exploitable. He glanced briefly at Vera. She already understood. Her expression stayed controlled, but her awareness sharpened. Park continued. The goal was not the document. He paused. The goal was response timing. Hyun finally spoke from the door. Response timing for what? Park looked at him. For identifying who stabilizes uncertainty fastest under conflicting narrative input. Silence. Rafe exhaled slowly. That is not business. Park nodded. No. It is calibration. The room changed after that. Not physically, but structurally. Because once intent is named, everything inside the system stops being ambiguous. And ambiguity is where most power lives. Rafe stood slowly, walked toward the glass surface between them. Not aggressively, not confrontationally, but like someone closing distance to a problem that can no longer remain abstract. You retelling me, he said, that both of us were part of an evaluation. Park nodded. Yes. Rafe tilted his head slightly. And you only realized this after you reacted. Park didn't hesitate. Yes. Rafe looked at Vera again, and you. Vera met his eyes. I realized earlier, she said. Silence. That mattered. Park looked between them now. You understood this before I did, he said to Vera. Vera didn't deny it. I suspected structure, she said. I didn't confirm scale. Park nodded slowly. That is consistent with what I was told about you. That sentence shifted something subtle. Rafe noticed immediately. What were you told? Rafe asked. Park hesitated again, then answered. That you reduce interpretive variance. Silence. That phrase hung in the air longer than it should have. Reduce interpretive variance. Not translator. Not interpretation. Vera finally spoke. That is not a compliment, she said quietly. Park nodded. No. It is a function description. Rafe's expression hardened slightly. And who defines that function? Park looked at him. I don't know. That was the first honest uncertainty he had offered. And it mattered. Because uncertainty from someone like Park Jin-ho is not ignorance. It is boundary admission. Hyun stepped forward slightly. I need to be clear, he said. If this is structured external calibration, then continued exposure increases risk across all parties. Rafe turned slightly toward him. You re-saying what? Hyun hesitated. That staying in this environment with overlapping narrative interference increases probability of misalignment escalation. Vera translated softly. He is saying continued interaction inside this system increases risk of conflict escalation due to information distortion. Rafe nodded slowly. So separation is safer. Hyun didn't answer immediately. Then, yes, silence. Park shook his head slightly. That assumes separation removes observer influence. Rafe looked at him. What does it do instead? Park's voice lowered slightly. It isolates interpretation points. That sentence mattered more than it sounded. Rafe understood immediately, which makes them. Park nodded once. Yes, silence again. Vera spoke quietly. So there is no safe configuration. Park looked at her. No stable one. That was the core truth. Not conflict. Not resolution. Instability as condition. For the first time, Rafe sat back down, not because he was yielding, but because standing no longer changed comprehension. He looked at Vera. You said earlier this was about interpretation control. Yes. And now? She paused. Now it is about measuring how interpretation changes under forced ambiguity. Rafe nodded slowly. So we are inside a behavioral model. Yes, Park added quietly. And we are no longer participants. Silence. We are inputs. That word landed heavier than anything else in the room. Inputs. Not actors. Not negotiators. Not rivals. Data points in a system observing reaction integrity. Rafe leaned forward slightly again, and the document, Park answered immediately, was never the center. Vera translated softly. He is saying the document was a trigger artifact. Rafe exhaled slowly. So Marco was used as a placement mechanism. Park nodded. Yes. And the Hong intermediary. Yes. And Vera. That one lingered longer. Park looked directly at her. Yes. Silence. No one corrected it. Because correction would be denial. and denial was no longer structurally useful. After the meeting ended, no one shook hands, not because hostility had increased, but because relevance had decreased. Outside, the corridor felt longer again. Rafe walked slightly ahead, Vera beside him, Hyun behind. Park remained in the room. Tommy stayed with him. The system inside the room had not ended. It had simply paused observation of certain variables. Rafe finally spoke once they were alone in motion. They identified you early, he said to Vera. Yes, and you didn't tell me fully. I told you what was confirmed. Rafe nodded. That distinction is becoming your entire operating principle. Yes. He glanced at her, and it is correct. Vera didn't respond immediately. Then, it is necessary. Rafe looked forward again. That is not the same thing. Silence. Then she said quietly, I know. And that was the first time the conversation stopped being about translation and became about trust inside systems that no longer behaved predictably. Because what Park Jin-ho had unknowingly confirmed was not just external manipulation. It was something deeper. They were not inside a negotiation anymore. They were inside a controlled observation of how humans assign meaning, when meaning itself is being continuously rewritten. And in that kind of system, the most dangerous person is not the one who speaks. It is the one who knows how every word will be understood before it is spoken. Rafe had stopped believing in coincidence. Not because he was paranoid, because coincidence in his world always came with a receipt. And receipts meant someone had already decided what you were going to think about it. The meeting that morning never officially began. It dissolved before structure could form, which in itself was structure, just a different kind. Park Jin-ho arrived first again. But this time he didn't sit. He stood near the window of the sealed conference room, hands behind his back, looking out over Seoul like he was measuring distance rather than city. Vera stood slightly behind Rafe, as always. But now that positioning felt less like protocol and more like alignment. Adrian Keller was present, Hyun was not. That alone told Rafe everything he needed about internal pressure. Park finally spoke without turning. This is no longer a negotiation, he said. Rafe didn't respond immediately. Because that sentence was not informational. It was directional. He walked forward slowly. Then what is it? Rafe asked. Park turned now, and for the first time there was no hostility in his expression, only exhaustion. A containment event, Park said. Silence. Vera didn't translate that immediately. She waited. Because translation wasn't just language anymore. It was timing, and timing changed meaning. Rafe glanced at her. She spoke quietly. He saying this is being treated as controlled instability. Rafe's eyes narrowed slightly. Controlled by who? Park answered before Vera could translate. By someone who is not in this room. That was the first true confirmation. Not suspicion. Not inference. Confirmation of external authorship. Rafe stepped closer to the table. Then we agree on something, he said. Park looked at him. What? Rafe's voice stayed calm. We are both inside something we did not initiate. A pause. Park nodded once, yes. That single word carried more weight than the entire negotiation so far. Because agreement between rivals is not peace, it is shared vulnerability. Adrian Keller finally spoke. This system is reacting to informational interference, he said. Rafe turned slightly. Define interference. Keller hesitated, then looked toward Vera. That hesitation mattered, because it meant she was already identified as a variable, not just a function. Translation mediation is altering outcome predictability, Keller said carefully. Vera didn't react, but Rafe saw it. The tightening of understanding, not emotion, recognition. Rafe spoke. That is the role. Keller shook his head, not at this level. Park finally stepped away from the window. You are not just translating language, he said to Vera. You are translating intention. Silence. Vera finally responded, that is the same thing. Park shook his head. No, he said quietly. It is not. That distinction landed like a fracture line in the room, because intention can be hidden, but translation exposes it. And exposure changes power distribution. Rafe looked at Vera, then back at Park. Someone is exploiting that exposure, he said. Park nodded. Yes, who? Park didn't answer immediately, because the answer wasn't a name, it was structure. Finally, a coordination layer operating between advisory channels, he said. Rafe's gaze sharpened, meaning what? Park turned slightly, meaning no single actor is controlling outcomes. They are controlling divergence, silence. Vera spoke quietly. Divergence between expected meaning and received meaning. Park looked at her. Yes, that was the confirmation point, not conflict. System design. Rafe exhaled slowly. So Marco was never the origin, he said. Park shook his head. No, he was a transmission point. Yes, Vera added quietly. And I was the amplification point. No one corrected her. Because she was right. The meeting broke not because it resolved, but because continuation became redundant. Outside the room, the air felt different, not safer, just more exposed. Hyun was waiting down the corridor. He looked like he had not slept. He looked like someone carrying information that no longer belonged to any single owner. He approached Rafe first. It says spreading, Hyun said. Rafe didn't respond immediately. Define spreading. Han lowered his voice. Advisory distortions are appearing in Milan channels. That changed trajectory instantly. Because Milan meant infrastructure outside Asia, which meant this was no longer localized interference. Vera spoke, it's replicating. Hyun nodded. Yes. Rafe looked at her. They are testing scalability. Vera nodded once. Yes. That word mattered. Because scalability means intent is not situational. It is systemic. Rafe turned slightly. Then this was never about Park Jin-ho. Hyun shook his head. No, it was about observing cross-system interpretation under pressure. Silence. That was the real realization. Park was not the target. Rafe was not the target. Even Vera was not the target. The target was the relationship between interpretation and authority. That evening, Rafe made a decision that altered every prior assumption about containment. He requested a closed-channel meeting. Not with Park, not with Keller, not with Hyun, but with Vera alone. In a neutral space again, no corporate framing, no witnesses, just signal clarity. When she arrived, she paused at the door for half a second longer than usual. Noticed. You already know something changed, he said. Yes, she replied. He gestured for her to sit. She didn't immediately, that was new, not defiance. Calibration finally, she sat. Rafe didn't waste time. I accessed external routing data, he said. Vera didn't react outwardly, but her focus sharpened and… Rafe continued. It is not targeting individuals. Silence. It is targeting translation dependency structures. Vera nodded slowly. That matches pattern replication. Rafe watched her carefully. So you already suspected. I suspected architecture, she said. I just didn't know the scale. That honesty mattered again, because uncertainty inside precision roles is dangerous only when hidden, not when acknowledged. Rafe leaned forward slightly. They are testing whether meaning can be destabilized faster than decision cycles can adapt. Vera nodded again. Yes. And the interpreters are the stress point. Yes. Silence. Then Rafe said something unexpected. No. Vera looked at him. He continued. The interpreters are not the stress point. A pause. They are the control surface. That shift changed everything again, because control surface implies intentional interface design, not vulnerability, function. Vera absorbed that. Slowly. Then if that's true, she said. Rafe nodded. It escalates it. Descalates it. Silence. Vera leaned back slightly. Then they want escalation. Yes. To measure reaction speed under degradation conditions. Yes. Another pause. Then Vera said something quieter, and to see who adapts first. Rafe looked at her. Yes, that was the final confirmation. This was not negotiation collapse. Not conflict escalation. It was behavioral mapping. Vera stood eventually, walked to the window, looked out over Seoul again. But differently this time. Not as a city, as a dataset under observation. Rafe watched her. You understand what this means, he said. She didn't turn. Yes, it means every conversation you 12 translated has been observed as data. Yes, and your choices have been logged as variable influence points. Yes, silence. Then Rafe added, and you are still here. That made her turn. Yes, she said, because leaving would not change classification. Rafe studied her. So what would? Vera paused, then answered carefully, becoming unpredictable. That word lingered. Because unpredictability is the only resistance system that cannot be fully modeled. Rafe nodded slowly. That aligns with my next step, he said. Vera looked at him. What next step? Rafe met her eyes. We stopped translating intention. Silence. Vera's expression tightened slightly. That breaks communication structures. Yes, it creates ambiguity. Yes, and ambiguity is what they are exploiting. Rafe nodded. Then we weaponize ambiguity. That was not metaphor, it was inversion. Vera understood immediately. They want to be able to predict meaning distribution, she said slowly. Yes, she studied him. That increases risk. Yes, a pause. Then she said something that wasn't procedural. That also increases misunderstanding. Rafe nodded. Yes, silence. Then, which is exactly what they are measuring. When she left, Rafe stayed behind alone, not thinking in terms of business anymore, not even in terms of conflict, but in terms of systems learning themselves through distortion. He finally understood what this was. Not a war, not a negotiation. A behavioral simulation disguised as commerce, and Vera was the only stable translation point inside it, which meant she was no longer just part of the system. She was the anchor that made observation possible. And anchors, he realized, are always the first thing external forces test. Because if the anchor moves, everything else becomes unmeasurable. Rafe didn't sleep that night. Not because there was danger in the traditional sense, but because clarity had finally replaced confusion, and clarity was louder than chaos. Once a man understands the shape of the system he is inside, rest becomes a negotiation with awareness, and awareness does not sleep easily. Vera arrived just before dawn. She did knock. She never needed to anymore. The door was already unlocked. Rafe was standing near the window again, but this time he wasn't watching the city. He was watching reflection, not outside, inside. You confirmed it, she said softly as she entered. It wasn't a question. Rafe didn't turn immediately. Yes, a pause. Then he finally faced her. They are not building a negotiation model, he said. Vera nodded. No, they are building interpretain stress mapping. Yes. Silence settled between them like a third presence, not uncomfortable, but final in its precision. Rafe walked toward the table where a single folder lay closed. He didn't open it yet because some truths lose stability when touched too early. Instead, he spoke. Park was never the rival. Vera nodded. No, he was a node, yes. Rafe's gaze sharpened slightly, and I was not the target. Vera met his eyes. No. A pause. You were a controlled variable, under observation, silence. That phrasing mattered more than the truth itself. Controlled variable, not participant, not competitor, not actor. Variable. Rafe leaned back slightly. So the document, he said, was never leverage. Vera shook her head. No, it was noise injection. Yes. To observe interpretive divergence. Yes. Another silence. Then Rafe exhaled slowly. And Marco. Vera didn't hesitate. Was a delivery vector. Rafe nodded once. And you, that one hung longer. Vera didn't respond immediately. Not because she didn't know. Because she was deciding how to define herself inside a system that had already defined her. Finally, I was the consistency point, she said. Silence. Rafe studied her carefully. That is why they isolated you. Yes. Because the consistencies reduces entropy. Yes. And reduced entropy makes systems measurable. Vera nodded again. Yes. A pause. Then Rafe said something quieter. And dangerous. Vera looked at him. To whom? Rafe answered without hesitation. To whoever is feeding on unpredictability. Silence. That sentence reframed everything again. Not conflict, not manipulation, but consumption of instability as a resource. Later that morning, they met Park Jin-ho one final time, not in a corporate room, not in a controlled negotiation space, but in a private neutral suite arranged through Hyen, the kind of place where agreements are not made, only acknowledged. Park was already there when they arrived. He didn't stand, this time that alone was a signal, not disrespect, acceptance of endpoint. Tommy stood beside him, but quieter than before, less interpreter, more witness. Yun remained outside, which meant he no longer belonged to the Simpson inside this room. Park spoke first. There will be no further escalation from my side, he said. Rafe didn't respond immediately, because that statement was not resolution. It was withdrawal. He sat across from Park. Why now? Rafe asked. Park looked at him for a long moment. Because I understand what this is, he said. Rafe nodded slowly. And what is it? Park's answer was simple. An external evaluation of structural trust under conflicting interpretation pressure. Silence. Vera didn't translate that immediately, because she didn't need to. Rafe understood, and that mattered more than language. Park continued, I am not the objective. He looked briefly at Rafe, neither are you. A pause, his gaze shifted to Vera. But she is part of the mechanism. Silence, Vera finally spoke. I am not a mechanism, she said quietly. Park nodded. I did not say you were. A pause. I said you are part of one. That distinction mattered. Because identity and function are not always aligned. Rafe leaned slightly forward. Then what happens when the evaluation ends? Park's expression changed subtly. Not fear, not relief. Something closer to fatigue. I think it ends, he said. Silence. That was the most honest statement yet. After Park left, the room felt emptier than before. Not because presence was gone, but because structure had dissolved. Tommy lingered briefly, then followed his uncle. Hyun never entered, which meant he had already accepted outcome. Rafe remained seated. Vera stood near the window now. The positions had reversed without announcement. Rafe finally spoke. They were never testing negotiation. Vera nodded. No, they were testing interpretation under forced ambiguity. Yes. And responsibility, yes. Rafe exhaled slowly, so the entire conflict was artificial. Vera shook her head slightly. Not artificial, she said. Instructed. Silence. Rafe looked at her. That distinction matters. Yes. A pause. Construction implies intention, she added. Rafe nodded. So someone built this to study us. Vera corrected gently. Not us. A pause, how we translate reality under pressure. Silence. That difference mattered more than anything else. Because it removed ego from the equation and replaced it with system observation. Rafe stood finally, walked toward the table where the folder still remained closed. This time, he opened it. Inside were documents they had already seen in fragments, but now arranged, connected, complete in structure, not evidence, pattern map. He scanned it slowly, then closed it again. So this is what they see, he said quietly. Vera stepped closer, and what they think we are, yes. Rafe nodded slowly. That S wrong. Vera looked at him. Which part? Rafe's voice lowered slightly. We are not stable variables. A pause. We are adaptive ones. Silence. That changed interpretation again. Because adaptive systems cannot be fully modeled, only observed. Vera studied him carefully. What are you proposing? She asked. Rafe looked at her. A long moment passed. Then, we stop providing consistency. Silence! Vera understood immediately. You want to introduce controlled unpredictability. Yes, that increases interpretive noise. Yes. Has a measurement reliability. Yes. A pause. She studied him longer this time. And if they escalate, Rafe answered calmly. Then they lose structural clarity faster than they can recalibrate. Silence. That was the full-in version. Not defense. Not counterattack. System destabilization through intentional ambiguity. Vera walked back to the window, looked out at Seoul one last time, not as observer, but as participant stepping out of defined role. She spoke quietly. They will notice. Rafe nodded. Yes, and they will adapt. Yes, a pause. And then, what? Rafe looked at her. Then we stop being interpretable at all. Silence. That was not strategy anymore. It was disappearance from predictable meaning systems. Vera turned slightly. You understand what that does to communication. Rafe nodded. Yes. It collapses shared structure. Yes. A long pause. Then she said something softer. That is not neutral. Rafe met her eyes. No. It is necessary. Silence. When Vera finally left that evening, she paused at the door. Not because she was unsure, but because something had reached completion. She looked back once. Rafe was still standing near the table, folder closed, not looking at data anymore, looking at structure beyond it. She spoke quietly. You want to be the same inside the system anymore. Rafe nodded once. No, and neither will I. A pause. Yes. Silence held for a moment longer than before. Then she left, and this time, nothing in the room followed her out. Because what remained was no longer interpretation. It was decision, and decision, once made at this level, does not translate back into what it used to be. Rafe didn't look back when the plane lifted. He never did. Looking back was for men who believed the past still had influence over the present. Rafe had stopped believing that somewhere between Seoul and whatever version of himself was left after it. Beside him, the seat was empty. Not physically, but functionally. Vera had boarded a different flight 2 hours earlier. Rome, a different system, a different language structure, a different set of interpretations waiting for her arrival. That was the agreement. Not spoken, not written, but understood in the only way that mattered now. Clarity without dependency. The plane leveled out, the cabin lights dimmed, and for the first time in days, the world stopped actively translating itself inside Rafe's mind. He reached into his inner coat pocket. Two pieces of paper. One old, one new. The old one was worn at the edges. A name written in Italian, his father S., a memory he had carried longer than most alliances lasted. The new one was cleaner, Vera S. handwriting. A single Korean word, beneath a line of English he could no longer fully separate from meaning. He stared at it for a long time, not reading it, remembering it, because understanding had stopped being about language and started being about presence. In Rome, Vera sat alone in a small cafe near a side street that didn't belong to tourists. She didn't order anything immediately, just placed her bags beside her and opened it slowly inside her notebook, the same one, but heavier now, not physically, structurally. She flipped to the last page she had written in Seoul, paused, then added one line beneath it. Not about Rafe, not about the system, about something simpler. Some people do not translate into your life, they reorganize how you hear it. She closed the notebook and, for the first time in a long time, didn't immediately start analyzing what she had just written. In New York, Rafe stepped out of the private terminal into cold air that felt familiar in the way old habits do. Hyun was waiting, no words at first, just a nod. Then it stabilized, Hyun said. Rafe didn't ask what it referred to, he already knew. The system. The interference layer, the construct that had briefly turned negotiation into observation. Rafe adjusted his coat. No, he said quietly. Hyun looked at him. Rafe continued. It paused.
That distinction mattered.
Stability implies resolution. Pause implies continuation. Hyun understood. He nodded once. Park Jin-ho signed off, Hyun said. Rafe stopped walking. For what? Hyun hesitated. For disengagement. Rafe exhaled slowly. Not surprise. Confirmation. So he stepped out. Yes. Rafe nodded once and kept walking. Later that night, alone in his office overlooking Manhattan, Rafe placed both papers on the desks, side by side, old and new, past and present. But he didn't to treat them as symbols anymore. Symbols required interpretation, and interpretation was what he had stopped trusting. Instead, he simply observed them as records of proximity, not meaning. A knock came at the door. He didn't turn, enter. Yun stepped in, paused. Then placed a small device on the desk. What is this? Rafe asked. Hyun answered carefully. Residual trace logs from the advisory network. Rafe finally looked up, and Hyun hesitated. There is something consistent across all channels. Rafe waited. Hyun continued. Whenever Virashin was involved in interpretation, system deviation decreased locally, but increased globally. Silence. Rafe nodded slowly. That is expected. Hyun frowned slightly. It is? Rafe leaned back. She does stabilize systems, he said. She clarifies them. A pause. And clarity always moves pressure somewhere else. Hun absorbed that. Slow. Is that dangerous? Rafe looked at the window, at a city that never stopped interpreting itself. Yes, he said quietly. For the system. A pause. And for anyone who depends on confusion. Silence. Later, long after Hyun left, Rafe opened the window slightly. Cold air entered the room. He picked up Vera S' note. Read it again, not as translation, not as message, but as evidence of contact between two systems that had briefly stopped behaving like systems. He placed it back down, then spoke quietly into the empty room, not to anyone, not for anyone, just into space that no longer required interpretation. There was never a word for this, he said. A pause, then softer, until it happened. Outside, Manhattan kept moving. Inside, nothing resolved itself. But something had changed permanently in the way it would now be understood, and somewhere far away, in a cafe in Rome, Vera closed her eyes for a moment, not remembering the system, but remembering the silence that finally made sense without translation. This literary work is intended purely as fiction. Any similarities to real individuals or events are coincidental and arise solely from the nature of storytelling. The author does not claim accuracy regarding real-world details and does not intend to portray real-life circumstances.
In this story, power is not defined by money, violence, or fear. It is defined by something far more fragile and far more dangerous understanding. Rafael Moro begins as a man who believes he controls every outcome in his world. He is a mafia boss. used to negotiations where language is just a tool, not a barrier. But the moment he enters a foreign environment without access to language, everything he built his identity on quietly collapses. Not because he becomes weaker, but because he becomes dependent. And dependency in his world is more dangerous than any enemy. The real shift in this story does not come from betrayal or conflict. It comes from realization. Raphael learns that power is not only about commanding others, it is about being understood correctly. Because even the most powerful words lose value if they are misinterpreted, and even the strongest man becomes vulnerable if he cannot verify what is being said around him. Vera represents something even more important than translation. She represents interpretation, the ability to shape meaning without changing truth. Through her, Raphael discovers that communication is not neutral. It is structured, filtered, and often influenced by perspective. This creates a moral question that runs quietly beneath the entire story. If meaning can be adjusted without changing words, then who truly holds power, the speaker, or the one who is understood? But the deeper lesson is not about control, it is about trust. Raphael is forced to trust someone he cannot fully monitor, predict, or dominate. And Vera, in turn, carries the ethical weight of that responsibility. She must decide when to remain purely professional, and when to protect someone from misunderstandings that could escalate into violence or destruction. This tension reflects a real moral truth. Influence always comes with responsibility. The more power someone has over interpretation, whether in language, leadership, or decision-making, the more carefully they must use it. The story also challenges a deeper human illusion that independence equals strength. In reality, the most powerful individuals are often the most dependent on others, not for survival, but for clarity. No one leads alone. No one sees everything alone, and no one understands everything alone. In the end, this is not a story about a mafia boss or a translator. It is a story about how fragile communication shapes human decisions, relationships, and power itself. The moral is simple but uncomfortable. Being strong does not mean controlling everything. It means knowing when to trust the people who help you see clearly and accepting that without them, even power becomes blind.